I'm Haley Morgan, 26 years old, and the last thing I remember before the glass shattered was the sound of my father's voice calling me useless. It happened at a charity gala packed with donors, chandeliers, and people who pretended to admire him. My heel caught on the edge of a rug, a small splash of red wine hit the marble, and the next second his hand met my face so hard my ears rang. Every conversation in the room went silent. The band stopped mid-note, and for a breathless moment the only sound was the echo of that slap. My cheek burned, my pride burned more, and when he told me to get out, I did heels clicking down that endless hallway, like gunshots no one dared to acknowledge. Before I go any further, tell me where you're listening from in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe if you've ever had to stand tall after someone tried to break your spirit. I grew up in the kind of home people envy from a distance, a 3-story colonial on Beacon Hill with trimmed hedges, polished floors, and a view of the harbor. Inside it was colder than the Boston winters that froze the Charles. My father, Richard Morgan, believed reputation was oxygen. He managed half the city's properties and expected his family to perform like part of his brand. My brother Evan learned early how to please him: firm handshake, quiet confidence, never question authority. I learned how to disappear. After my mother Laura died when I was 11, her warmth went with her. The house filled with rules instead of laughter, and my father started referring to our lives as assets. Every morning, I wore what he approved, spoke when spoken to, smiled on cue. At school, I was the quiet girl who never wanted to be noticed, terrified of making a mistake that might travel back to his office. When college came, I earned my degree, turned down law school, and took a modest job at a nonprofit helping displaced teens. I wanted a life built on kindness, not fear. But to him, that was failure. He said I was wasting my education, called me soft, as if compassion were a defect. I kept telling myself he'd be proud someday if I worked hard enough, if I stayed calm enough, if I stopped wanting anything he couldn't measure in dollars. When the annual Morgan Foundation Gala invitation arrived, I almost didn't go. Those events had always been about him, his success, his image in the papers the next morning. But something in me still wanted to prove I could belong in that glittering world without embarrassing him. I chose a simple black dress my mother used to wear, the one that still carried the faint scent of her perfume. I told myself that if I moved carefully enough, smiled politely enough, maybe I could survive one night without incident. The ballroom sparkled under crystal chandeliers, the air thick with perfume and power. Guests laughed over champagne, whispering about new developments and campaign donations. I stayed near the edges, handing empty glasses to waiters, pretending not to notice how people's eyes slid past me to find my father. Across the room, he stood beside Evan, beaming for photographers, the proud patriarch and his perfect son. I caught a glimpse of their matching cufflinks, silver with the family crest, a symbol I'd never been given. For a moment, I almost believed I could fade into the background unnoticed. Then, the accident happened. My heel caught the rug, the glass tipped, and a stream of Merlot streaked down onto the marble. It wasn't much, just a small stain that would wipe clean, but my father's gaze snapped toward me like a whip. I saw his face tighten, not with shock, but with fury, waiting for an excuse. His hand rose before I could speak. The impact sent me stumbling, the taste of iron filling my mouth. No one moved. Not the guests, not Evan, not the waiters, frozen mid-step. My father's voice cut through the silence, sharp enough to slice the air. "Useless girl. Get out." It wasn't the voice of a father. It was the voice of a man protecting his brand. The chandelier light fractured against the floor as I turned away, the hum of conversation slowly returning behind me as though the moment had already been erased. Outside, the December air bit through my skin. I walked across the gravel drive, every step echoing with the realization that something inside me had snapped, not just from the slap, but from the years leading to it. I drove home with my hands shaking on the wheel, headlights streaking through falling snow. The city blurred past, familiar yet distant, as if I were finally seeing it through someone else's eyes. When I reached my apartment, I kicked off my heels and sank onto the couch. My phone vibrated with message after message, missed calls from numbers that once meant family. Not one of them asked if I was all right. 53 calls, all demanding silence, all reminding me who held the power. I stared at the screen until the buzzing stopped, realizing that for the first time in my life, I didn't have to answer. The bruise on my cheek throbbed with every heartbeat, but beneath it, something steadier began to form, a quiet certainty that the life I'd known had just ended and something new was about to begin. The morning after the gala, I woke to a gray sky pressing down against my window. The city felt muffled, as if even the air didn't want to move. My cheek was still sore, the skin faintly bruised where his hand had landed. When I touched it, the sting reminded me it had really happened, that it wasn't just another moment I could excuse or minimize. The silence of my apartment seemed heavier than usual, broken only by the faint hum of the radiator. My phone lit up beside me, screen crowded with messages. 53 missed calls glowed in a neat column. The names were familiar: Dad, Evan, Morgan Estate. Each one landed like a weight. None of them said, "Are you all right?" They weren't checking if I made it home. They wanted control of the story before it slipped out of their hands. I scrolled without opening any of them, my chest tightening. The last voicemail came from my father himself. I pressed play and listened. His tone was composed, almost pleasant. "Last night was unfortunate," he began. "Accidents happen, Haley. But let's not blow this out of proportion. You embarrassed yourself. Don't embarrass this family any further." I played it again to be sure I'd heard correctly. His words were measured, chosen like legal language, but the message was the same one I'd heard my entire life: silence is survival. A new text appeared from Evan. "We should talk. Maybe you misread the moment. Don't let emotions ruin what's left." I stared at the screen until the words blurred. What was left? A bruise, a memory, and a hollow space where family was supposed to be. I tossed the phone onto the couch and turned it face down. The buzzing didn't stop. My eyes caught something on the bookshelf, a faded green notebook wedged between old paperbacks. I hadn't touched it in years. It was my high school journal, the one I'd hidden from everyone. I pulled it free and sat by the window, the light dull and wintry. The first pages were filled with neat handwriting, the kind of careful penmanship of a girl trying to make sense of a world that kept changing the rules. Dinner. He said my hair made me look unprofessional. Evan got a new watch. I got silence. Father told guests I dropped out of college. I hadn't. He said I should smile more, that my face looks ungrateful. I flipped through page after page, each one a record of small humiliations I'd forced myself to forget. At the time, I thought I was just venting. Now I realized it was evidence, a pattern of control of erasure. I reached the last blank page and took a pen from the desk. Across the top, I wrote, "The night he hit me." Beneath it, the words flowed out in steady lines where it happened, who was there, what he said, and what Evan didn't. Writing steadied me. It wasn't revenge. It was proof to myself, if no one else, that what happened was real. I closed the notebook and placed it on the table beside my tea. The steam had gone cold, but my mind was clear for the first time in days. A sharp knock startled me. It was the mail carrier dropping off a stack of envelopes and a thin white box addressed in formal script from Morgan Public Relations. Inside was a folded note on embossed stationery. "We hope this can be resolved quietly. Please refrain from public discussion. Further statements will be considered defamatory." I set it down and stared at the signature someone named Dana, a PR officer I'd met only once at a fundraiser. There was no apology, only strategy. I needed air. I grabbed my coat and keys, the notebook under my arm, and stepped into the cold. The city was awake, but distant traffic rumbling below the steady drizzle. I didn't know exactly where I was going until I found myself driving toward Davis Square, a part of town I hadn't visited in years. My father's younger sister Diana lived there. Diana was the ghost no one talked about. When I was little, I used to hear her name in passing, usually followed by words like reckless or embarrassment. My father said she'd ruined her life by walking away from opportunity. What he meant was that she'd refused to marry the man he chose for her, refused to live by his rules. I hadn't seen her since my mother's funeral. Her building was old brick with ivy curling around the front steps. The buzzer by the door still had her name. My hand hesitated before pressing it. When her voice came through the speaker, it was calm, curious. "Hello, it's Haley," I said softly. "Richard's daughter." There was a long pause, then the lock clicked. "Come up." Her apartment was warm and cluttered, filled with books and the faint scent of coffee. Photos covered the walls, mountains, dogs, small-town streets, places that looked free. She stood near the window, hair streaked with silver eyes, sharp and familiar. She looked at me for a long moment and said quietly, "I've been waiting for you." That sentence undid me. I hadn't cried since the gala, but the tears came now, quiet and steady. I told her everything what happened at the party, the silence that followed, the messages, the way my father's voice turned every apology into an order. She didn't interrupt. She just listened, her expression unreadable, her hands folded loosely around a mug. When I finished, she took a deep breath. "You know, she said your father once hit me too. Not with his hand, with words, in public, over and over until I started to believe him." I looked up. "What did you do?" She smiled, but it was small, tired around the edges. I walked out. Then I built a life so solid he couldn't shake it with one word. The words settled between us like a weight I'd been carrying alone for years. She poured tea, the kind with real leaves, not bags, and slid a cup toward me. They want your silence because it's the one thing they can control. Once you speak, they lose that. That night, she offered me the guest room. It was nothing fancy, a twin bed, a stack of old quilts, a crooked bookshelf, but it felt safer than anywhere I'd been in a long time. As she turned off the hallway light, she said one thing over her shoulder. "Tomorrow we start." I didn't ask what she meant. I just nodded, the green notebook still in my hands. When morning came, light filtered through the curtains in thin, cold strips. Diana was already in the kitchen pouring coffee and sorting through an old cardboard box labeled Morgan Legal. She handed me a mug and gestured to the papers spread across the table. "Your father's history," she said. "Letters, settlements, things he doesn't want seen." Inside the box were documents dating back years, emails, old property transfers, notes from former employees. They told a story I already knew in my bones. Intimidation, fear, silence traded for security. Diana looked up from the papers. "He's done this before," she said. "You think that slap was personal?" "It's a pattern." My phone buzzed again, another message from my father, this time short and final. "Let this go, or face the consequences. R.M." I placed it face down on the table. The sound didn't scare me anymore. It only made something inside me settle. Diana pointed to my notebook. "That's your foundation. Now we build around it." We spent the rest of the morning listing dates, names, and places. The Gala. The fundraiser where he lied to a reporter about me being unemployed. The Christmas he gave Evan a car and told me my presence was enough. Every detail mattered. She showed me how to encrypt files, how to back up recordings, how to write an email that couldn't be traced. By evening, the dining table was covered in notes, color-coded and highlighted. Diana flipped her laptop around to show me a spreadsheet of property transfers. One caught my eye, an oceanfront parcel moved into an offshore trust 3 days after the gala. I frowned. "He's hiding assets." She nodded. "He's scared. That's how men like him prepare for war." The words felt like a promise. Later that night, when the apartment went quiet, I stood by the window, watching the streetlights flicker. My reflection stared back at me, bruised, exhausted, but no longer afraid. I picked up my phone and opened a blank email. Subject line: "What do you know about publishing a truth they don't want told?" I hovered over the send button for a moment, then pressed it. Outside, snow began to fall thin and quiet, covering the streets in white. For the first time, I didn't feel small beneath it. The story that had always belonged to my father was finally slowly becoming mine. The morning light at Diana's apartment came through pale and thin, spreading across the cluttered table, where our papers still lay from the night before. I hadn't slept much, but I felt steadier than I had in weeks. Diana moved quietly around the kitchen, pouring coffee into 2 chipped mugs, while the printer hummed in the corner, spitting out another set of records she'd dug up. The air smelled of ink and toast. She handed me a mug and said, "We've got work to do." We spent hours cross-checking the details we'd collected, old donations, property transfers, the trust that held the Cape Ann house. Every time a date lined up with one of my journal entries, we highlighted it. By noon, the table looked like a map of my father's shadow, every yellow mark another way he'd controlled or concealed. Diana tapped her pen against a page. "See this," she said. "He moved the trust 3 days after the gala. He's preparing for fallout." I stared at the document, the ink still faintly warm from the printer. "He's scared," I said quietly. "Good," she answered. "Fear means the power's shifting." Her words settled over the room like a vow. I thought about the email I'd sent the night before the one to my old journalism professor, Alan Reed. He had taught investigative reporting before retiring from the university, the kind of man who believed truth was a civic duty, not a career. I'd taken one class with him in college, and he'd told us, "If you ever stumble across something people are desperate to hide, you probably found something worth telling." At 2 p.m, a reply appeared in my inbox. Subject: republishing a truth. It was short. "Haley, I remember you. Let's talk. I can meet tomorrow morning. Boston Public Library Cafe, 10 a.m. My hands trembled a little as I read it. Diana glanced up when I told her. "Good. He's one of the honest ones. Don't go in as a victim, go in as a source. Bring everything." That night, I packed a folder with copies of the documents, a flash drive of the encrypted files, and my green notebook. The bruise on my cheek had faded to a faint yellow, but it still ached when I washed my face. I stood at the mirror longer than usual, tracing the reflection of someone I barely recognized. I didn't look like the quiet daughter who used to wait for permission to speak. I looked like someone ready to be heard. The next morning, I arrived early. The library cafe smelled of espresso and old pages. People spoke in low voices, the sound of rain muffled against the tall windows. When Professor Reed walked in, I recognized him instantly. Tweed coat, wire-rimmed glasses, the same calm eyes that had once scanned a room full of students daring us to ask harder questions. He greeted me with a handshake and a kind smile. "I read your message twice," he said, sitting across from me. "You mentioned records witnesses and a pattern. Tell me everything." I took a breath and began from the start, the gala, the slap, the silence that followed. I showed him the notebook, the dates, the property transfers. His face remained composed, but I saw his jaw tighten as he turned each page. "You've documented this well," he said finally, "and you have corroborating evidence. That's rare." He asked careful questions. Who else knew who might talk what risks? I understood. When I told him about Diana's help, he nodded with quiet respect. "Your aunt's right. This isn't just family business. It's a pattern of public behavior by a man who hides behind power. If you're ready, I can connect you with someone at the Boston Standard. They'll verify everything before they publish." For a moment, I stared at him, the noise of the cafe fading behind the pounding in my chest. "You think they'll believe me?" He leaned forward slightly. "They won't have to believe you. They'll have proof." He gave me a card with a name on it. Erin Walsh, Investigative Desk, and told me she'd reach out that evening. As we stood to leave, he paused. "Haley, once this starts, it won't stop until it's finished. Make sure you're ready to lose whatever piece you still have." Outside, the rain had turned to slush. I walked the few blocks back to the subway, clutching the folder under my coat. My phone buzzed twice first, a new text from Evan, then another from my father's assistant. The messages blurred together into the same refrain, "Call us." "This can still be resolved." I deleted them both. By the time I reached Diana's apartment, she already had soup simmering on the stove and a small radio playing softly in the background. I told her everything. She listened, stirring slowly, then smiled. "Alan Reed. Good choice. He doesn't scare easily." That night we organized everything. Again, scans, backups, a timeline clear enough that even a stranger could see the pattern. I made a digital copy of my notebook labeling every page by year. Around midnight, we sat at the kitchen table with mugs of tea gone cold. Diana glanced toward the window, where the city lights shimmered through mist. "You know he'll come after you first. He always goes after the person who tells the truth, not the one who caused the harm." I nodded. "I know. Then be ready," she said, "and don't flinch when the storm starts." The next day passed in slow motion. At noon, an email came from Erin Walsh asking for a call. Her tone was professional but kind. We spoke for over an hour as she walked me through the process: verification, legal review corroboration from third parties. She asked for copies of every document, then for permission to record the call. Her questions were precise. Who witnessed the Gala incident? Were there prior accounts of similar behavior? Did you ever receive threats to remain silent? When the call ended, I forwarded the files through a secure link Professor Reed had set up. Then I sat back and stared at the ceiling, the old pipes rattling overhead. For the first time, I realized this was no longer just about my father's temper. It was about truth standing against power. That evening, a different message arrived from Evan. It was longer this time. Dad wants to meet, just the three of us. No lawyers, no media. We can make this right. The tone was familiar, clean corporate rehearsed. I showed it to Diana. Go, she said after a moment. Not for them, for yourself. Sometimes you have to look a person in the eye to understand what you're really fighting. I agreed to the meeting, setting it for the following afternoon, in a neutral space, a conference room at a downtown law office suggested by Evan. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake listening to the faint sound of snow tapping the window and thought about the years of silence that had led to this moment. Every word I'd ever swallowed now felt heavy on my tongue, waiting to be spoken. In the morning, I dressed simply, black turtleneck wool coat, hair tied back. Diana walked me to the door and pressed a small silver pendant into my hand. Your mother's, she said softly. Wear it if you forget who you are in that room. The drive downtown was quiet. The streets were lined with salted slush and bundled pedestrians. The law office sat in a tall glass building overlooking the river, sterile and echoing. I arrived early again, sitting in the waiting area, until a receptionist guided me to a small conference room. The walls were plain, the air too cold. I set my folder on the table and waited. When the door opened, Evan stepped in. First perfect suit, polished shoes, expression tight. My father followed, tall, composed, every inch the businessman addressing a problem, not a person. He sat across from me, hands clasped. You look tired, he said. I didn't respond. Evan cleared his throat. We're here to make this right. My father leaned forward. You made a mistake, Haley. That's forgivable. But what you're doing now, digging involving outsiders, that's reckless. I met his eyes. So is slapping your daughter in front of 100 people. His jaw twitched. You embarrassed me. I almost laughed. You embarrassed yourself. Evan tried to intervene, voice low, pleading. Haley, no one's saying it was okay, but we can handle this privately. There's a way to move past it without destroying everything. There's no clean way to hide the truth, I said. My father reached into his briefcase and slid a folder across the table. Sign this and we move on. You'll receive a settlement. Quietly. With dignity. I opened it. Non-disclosure agreement, monetary figure, waiver of claims. I closed it again. No. His voice hardened. If you go through with this, we will respond with legal action witnesses, proof of your instability. Evan looked down. I turned to him. Would you let him hit your wife? Your daughter. He didn't answer. The silence stretched until my father broke it with a growl. You are nothing without this family. You'll come back. I stood the pendant warm against my skin. You don't know me at all. That's why you thought I'd stay quiet. I walked to the door and paused. The air behind me felt heavy with disbelief. You built an empire on fear, I said quietly. Let's see how it holds up against the truth. When I stepped outside, the wind cut sharp through my coat, but it didn't sting. It felt clean, like something had lifted. The meeting hadn't changed him. It had changed me. Now I knew exactly what I was fighting for. I texted Diana, "It's done." Her reply came a minute later. "Then we begin." And that's how the silence finally started to crack. The day after the meeting with my father, the city felt sharper, as if the air itself had edges. Snow clung to the sidewalks, the sky the color of pewter. I met Diana at a small diner near her apartment, both of us still quiet from the night before. The coffee was burnt, the kind that tastes like it's been sitting for hours, but it kept my hands warm. She didn't ask about the meeting right away. She just looked at me with those steady eyes that had already seen how these things unfold. "He's not going to stop," she said finally. "I know," I answered. Then we moved faster. We returned to her apartment and began sorting through the files again. There was no panic now, just purpose. Each document we had collected told a story: the financial transfers, the settlements, the correspondence his lawyers thought would never see daylight. Every piece fit into the same pattern: a man who believed control was the same as love, and silence was loyalty. By afternoon, Erin Walsh called. Her voice carried the calm precision of someone who had spent years separating rumor from truth. She said the editorial team was reviewing the material and asked if I'd be willing to give a recorded statement. I said yes. The interview would take place in a secure office downtown, no cameras, just audio. Diana nodded approvingly as I relayed the plan. That night, I barely slept. I kept seeing my father's face across that conference table, the practiced calm in his eyes, the threat beneath his words. But under that image, another one lingered, the look of uncertainty when I said no. That was the moment something had cracked in him, and I realized the hold he had on me was already breaking. The next morning, I met Erin in a building that looked more like a law firm than a newsroom. She greeted me in a gray wool coat, her hair tucked neatly behind her ears, notebook in hand. "I know this isn't easy," she said, guiding me into a quiet room lined with sound panels. "Just speak in your own words. Don't try to make it perfect." The recorder clicked on, and for the first time I said everything out loud. I told her about the slap, the silence, the years of erasure, about the calls, the threats, the way my brother looked away. I described the documents Diana had uncovered, the asset transfers, the settlements hushed under confidentiality agreements. Erin asked clear, careful questions, never pushing too far. When it ended, she switched off the recorder and said softly, "You've done something brave. We'll take it from here." Outside, the cold wind caught my breath. I stood for a moment on the steps, staring at the frozen street, watching the steam rise from passing cars. Somewhere in those office towers, people were already reading my words, cross-checking them, building a case that would finally be seen. That evening, Diana and I spread the remaining evidence across the dining table once more. "We've done what we can," she said. "Now we wait." Waiting had never been harder. Each hour felt like holding my breath underwater. My phone stayed on silent, turned face down beside me. I didn't want to see what new messages my father might send. When the email from Erin finally arrived 2 days later, my heart jolted. Verification complete. Publication scheduled for December 24th. I read it twice before whispering it out loud. Christmas Eve. Diana smiled faintly. Poetic. It was also the night of the annual Morgan Foundation Gala, the same stage where he'd humiliated me. I didn't say it aloud, but I knew exactly where I'd be that evening. The following days moved quietly. Boston prepared for the holiday storefronts glittering with lights, people rushing through the cold with packages under their arms. Inside Diana's apartment, time felt suspended. We double-checked backups, created encrypted drives, printed physical copies of the most important documents. At one point, Diana looked up from her laptop and said, "Whatever happens next, don't let them define it. You tell the story your way." On Christmas Eve, I stood in front of the mirror fastening my coat. The bruise was gone, the mark invisible, but its memory sat under my skin. I slipped my mother's silver pendant around my neck and tucked the small flash drive into my pocket. Outside, the air was crisp and silent, the kind of cold that makes everything feel too still to be real. The hotel hosting the gala glowed like a jewel against the dark sky. Cars lined the entrance, cameras flashed, and voices echoed beneath the awning. I walked inside unnoticed, blending in with the swirl of sequins and tuxedos. The ballroom smelled of roses and champagne, just as it had that night weeks ago. A string quartet played softly from the corner, and servers carried trays of sparkling glasses. Across the room, I spotted my father on the stage, shaking hands with donors, the same polished smile that had once fooled the city. Evan stood nearby, face drawn, whispering to someone I didn't recognize. When my father stepped up to the microphone, the room quieted. His voice carried easily steady, authoritative, rehearsed. He spoke about dignity, legacy, and family values. At exactly 8:05, a murmur spread through the crowd. Phones buzzed. Screens lit up one by one. I watched as expressions shifted: confusion, surprise, disbelief. Someone near the front gasped. The headline flashed across dozens of screens at once. "Real estate titan under investigation for alleged abuse and financial misconduct sources. Confirm patterns of intimidation." Aaron's article was live. It included dates, documents, and the recorded voicemail. The truth was no longer just mine, it was public. On stage, my father froze mid-sentence. For the first time in my life, he looked uncertain. His assistant whispered something pale as paper. Evan's eyes darted toward the exits. The murmurs grew louder, spreading like a ripple through the glittering crowd. My father's voice broke through once more, this time harder, sharper. "This is a smear campaign," he said into the microphone. "She's unstable, vindictive." But the cameras were still rolling. The microphones were still live. And for once, people weren't looking away. I didn't wait for the rest. I turned and walked toward the exit, the sound of heels and whispers following behind me. The cold hit my face the moment I stepped outside, but it didn't sting. It steadied me. The city lights shimmered against the snow, and in that quiet, I finally exhaled. My phone buzzed in my pocket, dozens of messages, some from numbers I didn't know. "Thank you for speaking up. I thought I was the only one. You made me feel less alone." The words blurred as I scrolled, but one feeling remained clear: the silence had broken. When I got back to Diana's apartment, she was waiting by the window, her expression calm. She handed me a mug of tea still steaming. "It's done," she said. Outside, the snow began to fall again, soft and slow. The city was still awake, but the world felt different, quieter, not because of fear, but because the truth had finally been spoken. For the first time in years, I didn't feel small. I didn't feel silenced. I felt real. And though I didn't yet know what would come next, I knew this much: I wasn't walking back into the shadows he'd built for me. I was walking towards something of my own. The morning after the article was published, Boston woke up different. The city's front pages carried my father's name alongside words like investigation and misconduct. By breakfast, radio anchors were already dissecting his empire, replaying that voicemail in clipped sound bites. I sat at Diana's table with a cup of coffee going cold, the television muted, watching his photo flash across the screen, him at a podium, all confidence and control. Beneath it, the headline scrolled in quiet defiance of his power. Calls came in through the day: reporters, former employees, people I'd never met, but who seemed to know me now. I didn't answer most of them. Aaron handled the inquiries, keeping me shielded while the newsroom verified new claims. Still, it was strange watching my private pain become public record. My father's statement came by afternoon, short-rehearsed, and signed by his legal team. He denied everything, calling the report a baseless attack fueled by resentment. Diana muted the TV after it played. "He'll fight this with everything he has," she said, handing me the remote. "I know, but he can't fight the truth forever." The words steadied me. That night, I walked the quiet streets near her apartment, passing holiday lights, still glowing from the week before. The cold bit through my gloves, but I barely felt it. My breath fogged the air, carrying the taste of metal and memory. For the first time, I wasn't afraid of his anger. I was afraid of what might happen next, what silence he might still force, what shadows might still follow. Over the next week, the fallout spread. Sponsors withdrew from the Morgan Foundation. Board members resigned. My father's photo vanished from the company website. I heard from Erin every morning, her calm voice on the other end of the line, updating me on the investigation. "The Attorney General's office has requested files," she said one day. "They're taking this seriously." Evan didn't call for days. When his name finally appeared on my screen, I hesitated before answering. His voice sounded tired, almost older. "Haley," he said quietly, "you've started something you can't undo." "It was already broken," I replied. I just stopped pretending it wasn't. He didn't argue. He just sighed. "You've destroyed everything Dad built." I looked out the window at the snowfall drifting across the city lights. Then maybe it wasn't worth saving. The line went silent for a long time before he said, "I hope you find what you're looking for," and hung up. A few days later, a white envelope slid under Diana's door. No return address, just my name written in sharp, heavy ink. Inside was a single sheet of paper. "You'll regret this." I folded it once and dropped it into the trash. Diana didn't flinch when I told her. "Empty threats from a man losing control," she said. Still, she changed the locks that afternoon. The news cycle moved quickly, but the consequences lingered. My father's company began closing offices. Investigators froze assets tied to the offshore accounts we'd uncovered. Former employees came forward describing years of intimidation. Some reached out to me directly, their voices trembling as they thanked me for speaking up. I listened to each one, realizing how far his reach had gone. By February, I'd signed a short-term lease on a small apartment above a bookstore downtown. It was old but bright, with brick walls and uneven floors. The scent of paper and coffee drifted through the vents from the shop below. I furnished it slowly, a second-hand couch, a few framed photographs, a desk near the window. Diana helped me carry boxes up the narrow stairs, pausing once to catch her breath. "Feels right," she said, setting down a lamp. "Quiet suits you." It did. For the first time in years, the quiet wasn't heavy. It was peace. I started volunteering again, this time at a women's center not far from the harbor. They offered writing workshops for survivors of domestic and workplace abuse, and I began helping with the evening sessions, listening, reading drafts, guiding stories into shape. The women were all ages, all backgrounds. Some spoke freely. Others wrote in fragments, testing the sound of their own truth. I didn't tell them mine. I didn't have to. They already understood. One night after class, a woman named Lynn lingered by the door. She was in her 50s, soft-spoken but steady. "How did you know it was time to say something?" she asked. I thought for a moment. When the silence started to sound more like his voice than mine, she nodded slowly, eyes glistening. That's when I knew too. That conversation stayed with me for weeks. Every time I walked home past the bookstore's lit windows, I thought about how many women still lived inside someone else's silence, waiting for permission to speak. I knew now that telling the truth wasn't about revenge. It was about reclaiming breath. One morning, I received a message from Aaron Morgan Enterprises is dissolving its leadership board. Your father is stepping down. I stared at the screen for a long time. The man who had once called himself untouchable had finally been forced to bow to accountability. There was no celebration in it, just quiet relief. A few weeks later, I saw Evan again. He showed up unannounced at the bookstore one Sunday afternoon. I found him standing near the window display, his coat dusted with snow. He looked thinner, his tie loosened. "You look different," he said. "So do you," I replied. We sat on a bench outside the cold wind, carrying faint music from a street performer nearby. "I didn't come to apologize," he began. "I just wanted to understand why you had to go public." "Because he wouldn't stop," I said simply. "Because if I didn't, someone else would get hurt." He rubbed his hands together, silent for a long time. "He's not the same anymore," he said finally. "He barely leaves the house." "I know. I don't know what happens next. Neither do I." He nodded, then stood. "Take care of yourself, Haley." He walked away before I could respond. Watching him go felt like watching a door close quietly, without bitterness, but final. That evening, Diana came by with takeout and a stack of mail. "You're holding up," she said, glancing around my apartment. "I think I am," I said. She smiled, pouring tea into mismatched mugs. "You've earned your peace. Don't rush to fill it." Later, after she left, I sat by the window with my notebook open. The first page still read, "The night he hit me." I turned to the back and began writing again. Not about pain this time, but about what had grown in its place. Stillness, courage, a life that belonged entirely to me. Outside, the snow fell heavier, covering the streets in quiet white. The bookstore lights flickered off one by one. Somewhere in the city, my father was still fighting the truth, but his voice no longer reached me. The world I had built was small, but it was mine, and it was finally enough. When I closed the notebook, I realized something simple, yet profound. The story that began with silence had ended in choice. And for the first time, I didn't need anyone's permission to keep writing it. Winter slipped into spring, and with it came a strange kind of calm. The snow melted off the rooftops, revealing city brick again, and the air smelled faintly of rain. From my window above the bookstore, I could see people walking without hunching against the cold shoulders, lighter somehow. For months, my days had been filled with interviews, follow-up questions, legal filings. But as the investigation deepened, the work shifted away from me. Other voices stepped forward, former employees, business partners, people who'd been quiet for years. I had started something that now had its own rhythm, its own weight. One morning in early April, Erin called with an update. Her tone was calm but purposeful. "The state's opened a formal case against your father," she said. "They've traced offshore accounts, falsified donations, and a pattern of settlements. It's not just the abuse, it's financial fraud." I leaned against the kitchen counter, my coffee cooling in my hands. "What happens now?" "They'll move fast," she said. "The board has already cooperated. It's no longer just a story, it's evidence." After we hung up, I stood there for a long time staring at the steam curling from the mug. I had imagined this moment so many times, but now that it was here, it didn't feel like victory. It felt like the sound of something ending quietly without applause. That week, the headlines changed again. Morgan Empire crumbles amid fraud charges. Executives resign as investigators seize records. I read the articles once, then folded the paper and slid it into a drawer. The city's judgment was loud enough without me adding to it. Evan called 2 nights later. His voice was heavy, stripped of its usual polish. They froze everything he said. "Dad's accounts, the trust, the foundation. He's furious. He says you'll pay for this." I sat on the couch listening to the wind whistle through the window panes. "He already took everything I had," I said. "There's nothing left for him to take." There was a pause before he spoke again. "He's not well. He barely sleeps. He keeps asking where you are. He knows where I am." Evan sighed. "I don't think he ever really did." His voice softened. "Haley, I don't agree with what he did, but he's still our father." "I know," I said quietly, "but that doesn't make him right." The next morning, I found an envelope tucked under my door. The handwriting was his strong, deliberate, still as sharp as the man who used to sign contracts in front of cameras. I stood there for a minute before picking it up. The letter inside was short. "You've humiliated me. You've destroyed this family. I made you, and I can unmake you." I folded it once, set it on the table, and called Diana. She arrived within the hour, coat still damp from the rain. After reading the note, she exhaled slowly. "He's cornered," she said. "And when he's cornered, he lashes out. But he's not the man he used to be. Don't let him make you feel small again." We burned the letter in her sink that night, watching the edges curl into ash. Neither of us spoke until it was gone. The days that followed were quiet. I returned to the Women's Center, teaching writing workshops twice a week. The stories the women shared filled the room with something steady and sacred. They spoke of survival, of fear, of finding light in unexpected places. Listening to them, I realized that truth isn't always loud. Sometimes it's written in small, trembling handwriting that no one else ever reads. One evening after the workshop, Diana met me at the bookstore cafe. She placed a folded newspaper on the table. "You might want to see this," she said. On the front page was a photograph of my father leaving a courthouse. His expression was blank, his posture stiff. The headline read, "Richard Morgan indicted on 6 counts of fraud and coercion." I looked at the picture for a long time. The man in the photograph looked smaller than I remembered, not weaker, just hollowed out. I slid the paper back across the table. "I think this is the end," I said. "Maybe for him," Diana replied. "Not for you." The following week, I received another letter, this one from a law firm confirming that my father had entered a plea deal. He would serve a reduced sentence in exchange for full cooperation with the financial investigation. Reading it didn't bring satisfaction, only closure. The story was no longer mine to carry. In late May, I took a walk to the harbor. The air smelled of salt and early summer. Boats rocked gently against the piers, ropes creaking with the tide. I found a quiet bench and sat there for a while watching the sunlight shimmer on the water. For the first time, I let myself think of my mother, not as the woman who'd been silenced by his control, but as the one who had taught me long ago that truth has its own timing. That evening I cooked dinner with Diana in her kitchen. The windows were open, and the scent of roasted garlic mixed with the sound of passing traffic. She poured us each a glass of wine and raised hers slightly. "To starting over," she said. I smiled. to starting over. A few weeks later, I was invited to speak at a small community event hosted by the Women's Center. They wanted me to talk about courage, though the word still felt too big for what I'd done. The night of the event, I stood behind a simple podium facing a room of faces that reminded me of every version of myself I'd once been scared, uncertain, searching for permission to exist without apology. I used to think strength meant staying silent, I said, that it meant surviving quietly. But silence isn't strength. It's a cage someone else locks for you. The day you stop protecting what broke you is the day you start to heal. When it ended, people lined up to thank me. Teachers, mothers, young women clutching notebooks to their chests. One woman whispered, "You made me believe I can speak." I smiled because I understood. That was the truest victory of all. Afterward, I walked home through the soft summer air. The city lights reflected on the wet pavement, and the bookstore sign glowed faintly ahead. I paused outside my apartment listening to the quiet hum of traffic, the low rhythm of life continuing. The storm that had once ruled my world had passed. When I stepped inside, the first thing I noticed was the stillness. No buzzing phone, no news alerts, no demands, just the sound of wind moving through the open window. I made tea and sat at my desk opening my journal again. The first line I'd ever written the night he hit me had faded slightly, the ink softened by time. Below it, I wrote a new sentence. I am no longer afraid of being seen. Outside the city carried on, unaware that for one small apartment above a bookstore, peace had finally returned. I closed the notebook gently and set it aside. There was nothing left to prove, only life left to live. But as I looked out the window, I felt something stir, a sense that maybe my story wasn't ending here. Maybe it was only beginning again, somewhere quieter, somewhere honest. The kind of beginning my mother would have wanted. By midsummer, the heat in Boston came heavy and still settling over the city like a held breath. From my apartment above the bookstore, the street below shimmered in the sunlight. Life had begun to return to a rhythm, work errands, quiet dinners with Diana, but something in me hadn't caught up. The story was over in the world's eyes, but inside, the echoes hadn't stopped. Every few days, the newspaper would print another short piece about my father's case, legal updates, new depositions, court dates, moved and postponed. Each headline felt like a reminder of the old life I had already walked away from. One morning, while sorting through the mail stacked outside my door, I found a letter with his handwriting again. The return address said Essex County Correctional Facility. For a long moment, I just stared at it. The air in the hallway felt too thick. I carried it inside, set it on the kitchen counter, and made coffee before touching it again. When I finally opened it, the handwriting was as neat as ever, the same loops and lines that had signed business deals and birthday cards years ago. Haley, you've made your point. The press has had its fun. I'm paying the price for mistakes you didn't understand, but someday you will. Family is the only thing that remains when the world turns on you. I hope you can live with what you've done. There was no apology, no acknowledgement of the harm he'd caused, just pride dressed as wisdom. I folded the letter and placed it back in the envelope without another thought. That afternoon, I dropped it in the recycling bin behind the building and let the wind take whatever scraps the breeze could carry. That evening, Diana stopped by. She had a way of knowing when I needed grounding even before I said anything. We sat on my small balcony watching the streetlights flicker on. She poured iced tea into 2 mismatched glasses and leaned back. "You heard from him," she said quietly. I nodded. "From the correctional facility." She didn't ask what it said. She didn't need to. Instead, she told me about the summer she left home, the small apartment she'd rented in Vermont, the silence that felt like freedom, but also a kind of grief. "You think the storm ends once you leave," she said. "But really, that's when you start hearing what it left behind." Her words lingered after she went home. I understood what she meant. It wasn't guilt I felt anymore, just a hollow ache where fear used to live. A week later, I received a call from the Boston Standard. Erin's voice carried both excitement and caution. "We're running a follow-up piece," she said. "Not about him, about you. About the Women's Center, your workshops, the advocacy work you're doing. We want readers to see what came after." I hesitated. "I'm not sure I want to go through all that again." "It won't be about the past," she said. "It'll be about what you built from it." After a pause, I agreed. The interview took place a few days later in the same cafe where I'd first met Professor Reed months before. The smell of espresso, the quiet clatter of cups, everything felt familiar. Erin's questions were gentle, focused on my work, how writing had become a tool for healing how women found strength in telling their stories. For once, the recording device on the table didn't feel like a threat. When the article was published, it wasn't dramatic or sensational. The headline read simply, "From Silence to Strength, One Woman's Journey After the Morgan Scandal." Beneath it was a photo of me at the Women's Center, surrounded by the group I taught each week. The story spread quietly online, shared not for scandal, but for hope. Messages came in from people across the country, some thanking me, others sharing their own stories of reclaiming voice after years of silence. One email stood out. It came from a woman named Clara Benton, a former employee at my father's company. She wrote that she'd worked under him for 7 years, leaving after signing an NDA to escape his intimidation. "I saw what he did to you that night at the Gala," she wrote. "I wanted to say something, but fear wins until someone else breaks it first. Thank you for breaking it." I read that line twice, then sent it to Diana. Her reply was simple. "You've done more than survive, Haley. You've changed the story for others, too." August passed in slow heat. The bookstore owner downstairs, a kind man named Tom Bennett, who I'd gotten to know over cups of coffee and quiet conversations, offered me a small part-time job managing the community events space. I accepted. It wasn't glamorous, but it was honest work surrounded by stories, and that felt right. One evening after closing, Tom found me shelving books. I heard the follow-up story, he said. "Took courage to live that out loud." "I just told the truth," I said. "Sometimes," he replied, sliding a book onto the shelf beside me, "that's the hardest thing anyone can do." As fall approached, the air grew cooler again, and the city began to hum with its usual rhythm. Students returning, commuters filling the trains, the smell of roasted chestnuts near the park. I'd begun to move through it all without flinching at my own name, without worrying who might recognize it. One morning, as I locked my apartment door on the way to work, my phone buzzed. It was a voicemail from Evan. His tone was strained but careful. "Dad's health is declining," he said. "He's asking to see you. He says he wants to make peace." I stopped halfway down the stairwell, hand gripping the rail. I could hear the distant hum of the bookstore below, the sound of pages turning, life going on. For a long time I didn't move. That evening I told Diana. She listened quietly, eyes steady. "You don't owe him that meeting," she said. "I know. But if you go," she added, "do it for yourself, not for him." I thought about it all night, the years of silence, the humiliation, the letters, the words he'd never taken back. But somewhere in the quiet, I realized I wasn't afraid of him anymore. I wasn't that girl at the Gala shrinking under his voice. 2 days later, I drove to Essex County, following the route through narrow roads lined with fading summer trees. The facility stood on the outskirts of town, gray and stark against the sky. I signed in, passed through security, and was led to a small visitation room with glass between us. When he entered, he looked older, thinner, his hair nearly white. For a moment, neither of us spoke. He picked up the phone, his hand trembling slightly. "You came," he said. I sat down, meeting his eyes through the glass. I did. He looked away, staring somewhere over my shoulder. "You think you've won?" he said quietly. "But you'll understand one day. Family is still family." "I understand plenty," I said. "That loving someone doesn't mean letting them keep breaking you." He didn't respond. The silence stretched long between us, thick and final. I set the phone down and stood. His hand lifted as if to stop me, but he didn't speak again. Outside, the air was cool, the sky painted in shades of dusk. I stood in the parking lot for a while, watching the sun dip behind the trees. I thought about the years he'd ruled everything by fear, and how easily truth had undone it all. On the drive home, the radio played softly some old song my mother used to hum while cooking dinner. For the first time, I didn't feel the weight of her absence. I felt her presence instead steady and light, as if she'd been waiting for this moment all along. When I reached the city, the lights from the harbor shimmered against the dark water. I rolled down the window, letting the air rush in. I didn't know if forgiveness was possible, but peace was, and that was enough for now. When I woke the next morning, the city outside my window was washed in soft light. The sky over Boston was pale blue clear after a night of rain. For the first time in years, I didn't feel the weight of dread waiting beside me. The air itself seemed different, lighter, quieter, alive. I made coffee, opened the window, and let the sound of the street drift in. Somewhere below, a delivery truck rumbled past, and a child laughed. The world kept moving, and I was still here to meet it. The visit with my father had taken something out of me, but it had also returned something I didn't know I'd lost. Walking away from that glass wall, I'd realized I no longer needed his approval to breathe. The fear that once shaped every choice had nowhere left to live. What remained was stillness, and in that stillness, peace. Over the next few weeks, life settled into a quiet rhythm. I kept teaching at the Women's Center, guiding small writing groups where stories spilled out like steady rivers, some broken, some healing, all brave. I didn't talk about my father anymore. The women didn't ask. We understood each other without explanation. Their words filled the space where my own pain had lived, turning it into something useful. Diana visited often. We cooked simple dinners, walked by the harbor, and talked about everything except the past. She seemed lighter, too, as if helping me had allowed her to reclaim something of her own. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the water glowed gold, she said quietly, "You know, Haley, your mother would have been proud of you." The words caught me off guard. I hadn't heard her name spoken out loud in so long. I pictured her then, the soft curls she used to tuck behind her ear, the way her laughter could fill a room. For years I'd carried her absence like a wound. Now it felt more like a compass. In early autumn, the case against my father finally closed. He accepted a reduced sentence, most of his fortune seized to repay victims and investors. There was no trial, no spectacle. Just a few lines in the paper marking the end of an empire that had been built on fear. I didn't attend the hearing. I didn't need to. Justice doesn't always sound like a gavel. Sometimes it's just the quiet certainty that you told the truth and stood your ground. That evening, I went to the waterfront alone. The air was cool and smelled faintly of salt. I watched the ferries come and go, their lights reflecting on the dark water. Somewhere out there, life stretched beyond everything I had known, bigger, quieter, unpromised, but mine. When I came home, I pulled out the old green notebook. Its pages had begun to curl at the edges. The first entry, the one titled "The Night He Hit Me," was still there, written in trembling lines. I ran my fingers over the ink, then turned to the last page. In slow, steady handwriting, I wrote, "This is where I begin again." Then I closed it for the last time. Weeks passed. Leaves turned gold and drifted down across the bookstore's roof. I began organizing a new program at the Women's Center, free creative workshops, for teenagers from low-income neighborhoods. The board approved it in minutes. I could almost hear my mother's voice telling me that kindness once planted grows in directions we can't always see. One crisp afternoon, as I locked the center's doors, I saw Evan waiting by the curb. He looked uncertain, holding a small envelope in his hands. "Dad wanted this to reach you," he said quietly. "He's different now. You don't have to open it, but I promised I'd try." I took the envelope but didn't open it right away. We walked together for a block, not saying much. Before we parted, Evan turned to me. "I'm sorry," he said, "for all the times I didn't speak up." I knotted my throat tight. We both had to learn when silence cost too much. After he left, I stood by the riverwalk, the wind tugging gently at my hair. I opened the envelope. Inside was a single piece of paper. No accusations this time, no pride. Just a few lines written in shaky pen. "I can't undo what I've done. I hope one day you find it in you to forgive the man I couldn't be." I folded it back into the envelope and slipped it into my coat pocket. Forgiveness wasn't something I could give that easily, but it was something I could hope toward. Sometimes mercy is a direction, not a destination. That night I sat by my window, watching the city lights flicker across the glass. Somewhere below the bookstore, owner was locking up his radio playing an old jazz tune. I thought about the long road from that marble floor, the slap, the silence, the cold walk into the unknown, and how far I had come since. Every wound had built a bridge towards something stronger, something freer. When I finally turned off the lamp, I whispered a quiet thank you to my mother, to Diana, to the women who taught me that truth isn't a weapon, but a light. It doesn't destroy what's real. It reveals what's been hidden. And as the night deepened around me, I realized my story wasn't just about loss or justice. It was about learning to stand in my own name without fear. The world didn't need to remember what my father had done. It only needed to see what I'd become. So if you've ever been silenced or made to feel small, remember this: you are not defined by who hurt you, but by the courage it takes to heal. Thank you for listening. And if my story stayed with you tonight, take a moment to share it, or just hold space for someone who's still learning to find their voice, because sometimes that's how healing begins.